What's up, visionaries? Just wanted to give you a quick heads up that we experienced some technical problems while filming this interview. We felt like we captured lightning in a bottle. So rather than reshoot the whole piece, we've decided to air it as is, since the conversation was just so mind-blowing. Anatoly's video may drop in and out, but the audio and his handsome headshot will be there whenever that happens. Enjoy the conversation, one you can only hear on Real Vision Crypto. Welcome to the show, everybody. We've got an important conversation today about smart contracts, about scaling, and an impressive group to be joining us shortly. But first, let's introduce Kyle Davies, co-founder of Three Arrows Capital and an investor in both Solana and Starkware, both of which will be represented here shortly. He is also my co-moderator today. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks, Ash. Yeah, this is going to be a fun one.
Before we get started here, before we bring in Anatoly, Eli, and Avihu, tell us a little bit about what you do.
I co-founded Three Arrows Capital with Suzu, and we focus exclusively on crypto investing. So we invest in layer 1, layer 2 applications. We have a trading group, but broadly speaking, we focus on anything and anything we think makes money in crypto. And today's going to be a really fun one because we have a layer 1 protocol, a layer 2 protocol, both focused on scalability with very different approaches. So I'm pretty excited for this one.
Okay, so let's set the table there a little bit based on what you just said. First of all, let's give some context on what the challenges are with scalability.
There's broadly 3 things that a blockchain usually tries to accomplish. It's known as the blockchain trilemma. And that would be decentralization, scalability, and security. And these 2 blockchains have very different approaches to those 3 goals. So I thought it would be interesting just to go one by one and just see, how Anatoly and how Eli and Avihu think about each of those. And then maybe afterwards we can talk about applications, composability, things like that, that then can be added and applied to their blockchains in the future.
So also to frame out a little bit what we're talking about in layer 1 versus layer 2. So Solana is a layer 1 protocol. Starkware is a layer 2 scaling protocol on top of Ethereum. Give us a sense of what that means for people who aren't as in the weeds as you are.
In its most basic sense, it just means how the blockchain is secured. So Starkware relies on Ethereum for its security, whereas Solana has its own protocol for security. There are pros and cons for how those are set up, but I'd actually just like to ask each of them how they think about it.
Kyle, you set us up there with the perfect segue to bring in the broader group. Let's introduce who's going to be joining us now. It's Anatoly Yakovenko, CEO at Solana Labs, Eli Ben-Sasson, co-founder and president at Starkware, and Avihu Levy, head of product at Starkware. Guys, you were all listening when we had that conversation between Kyle and me. First of all, did we get the nature and framework of the problem correct? Tell us how you think about it. Anatoly, let's start with you, please.
There were kind of 2 questions there. One is, what do you think about layer 1 versus layer 2? And then how are you tackling scaling and scalability? So initially with design of Solana, we weren't really thinking about scaling blockchain for blockchain's sake. We had a specific use case in mind, and that was markets, price discovery. So cheesy slide deck for Solana was blockchain at NASDAQ speed. What that meant was that what we wanted to build is a system where when you send a bit of information to the network, it is propagated around the world with the lowest latency, as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible. And by definition, that requires all-to-all communication. So the problem that we really needed to scale was that fundamental problem, all-to-all communication that is kind of fundamental to BFT systems. How do we make sure that anybody in the world, that connects to the system, they observe the same state as everyone else, and they have guarantees that they're observing that same state, because that's critical for trading. And this was, partly driven by my experience trading on things like interactive brokers and CME and NASDAQ, where you had to give up your firstborn to get the data that you're submitting to them back. So I really wanted something where that execution of all the information and prices was as transparent as possible. So this is what the core problem that Solana is optimizing for. And The only way to do that is with hardware, because you're dealing with a lot of messages from all the nodes confirming that they're receiving this data and providing those guarantees that now this information is globally replicated. The layer 1 versus layer 2, I kind of think of it this way. If the system implements its own version of BFT, it's a layer 1. Doesn't matter if it's got some weird connection to another layer 1, but that's what fundamentally makes a layer 1. And then you can start thinking about, well, is there a bridge to another layer 1? Is that bridge a roll-up execution environment where you're guaranteeing that execution is the same at both chains and stuff? If a pure layer 2 is something where there is no additional BFT system, that this thing runs strictly directly on the finality of this other layer 1.
So, Eli, as you listen to that, the framework for how you guys think about Starkware, the challenge that you're trying to solve, and the execution of that solution, tell us a little bit about Starkware.
We have a set of technologies that is the culmination of more than 3 decades of mathematical and cryptographic research. And it is sort of the pinnacle of that research. We pushed it and advanced it a lot forward through a lot of inventions that were basically made inside Starkware, including Stark protocols, Fry protocols, Validium, Volition, Cairo, and many other things. And this set of technologies offers 2 things, and these things are pretty unique and also very important for all of humanity, but we're going to first spearhead them through blockchains. One is scalability, and I'll let Avihu explain in more detail exactly what kind of unique properties do Starks bring in terms of scalability. And the other aspect is privacy through zero knowledge. So we are in some sense blockchain agnostic, and this technology is even bigger than all of blockchain. It will start in blockchain. It has started in blockchains where it's really needed and also very much appreciated. And the very first blockchain on which it started was Ethereum. But this technology is bigger than just one solution in one L2 and will probably be adopted, whether with Starkware's help or without it, by all blockchains and then beyond that. But the way we solve scalability uniquely is something that I want Avihu to explain.
The way I like to think about it is that we provide scale in 2 dimensions. When you think on blockchain, you normally think of many nodes, and they all receive many transactions, and they execute them, they get the data from them, they execute them, and then they update the state. And if I want to summarize in one sentence, what do we provide is that we remove the need for those nodes, for all these, let's say, thousands and thousands of nodes in the network, to get this data for almost the entire data and to run any of the computation. So instead of getting tons of data and then executing tons of transactions and then updating the state, remove the need for the first 2. So one dimension of scale is the dimension of removing execution or making execution much cheaper. And the other dimension is that we remove the need to send over the network a lot of the data that otherwise would need to be sent.
So I should say, obviously, we have one person here today from Solana, 2 people here from Starkware. We're going to try and balance for time so that both sides get equal time here in the conversation. Let me jump back over to Kyle. Obviously, we have some very brilliant technical people, engineers on this Zoom session. Give us a little bit of a framework in terms of how you think about this. You're an expert at explaining this to investors who may not necessarily have the same level of technical detail. Frame out for us how you think about what we just heard and how it applies to the problems more generally speaking.
Sure. So I would preface this by saying I'm not the technical person here, but the high-level graphic version would be that Solana is scaling with hardware, Starkware is scaling with software to a certain degree, right? And this has certain implications for the decentralization. This has other implications for security and the whole blockchain trilemma. So I guess one of my questions maybe for Anatoly first would be, how do you think about these trade-offs? And how do you think about a successful end state. So if we get to NASDAQ performance, and not just one NASDAQ, but I think the goal is to have many different applications running. How do you think about how Solana will scale?
Sure. So the core difference is that, we can't remove the data. We have to propagate it, and we have to propagate the state, because that is the core proposition here, is that when you connect with the network, you receive all this information with some real-time guarantees. Right now, roughly 400 milliseconds is the guarantee. So if I'm somebody that's interested in all these new financial markets, all I need is a bit of hardware, which I can buy anywhere. And now I connect to this one single global prism for the entire world's price discovery engine. So if you think of it from that perspective, there is no shortcut to remove any of the trades, right? Every order that's submitted to Serum needs to be propagated. Every NFT change of ownership, that needs to be propagated. We don't really care about compressing that information, because receiving that information is the proposition, that all the subscribers actually get that data. They can build their models on top of it. They can build their financial applications on top of it, and so forth. So the challenge for us is a networking problem. It is, how do we shove as many packets into, 1 gigabit or 10 gigabit network pipes, and propagate them around the world as fast as possible with the, reliability in case there's adversarial, folks on the network and stuff like that. And that is a hard problem. And solving that meant that the capacity that each node has in terms of handling all these messages from all the other nodes is so large that execution of the actual state transitions, when you look at Amdahl's law, that's a very small part of it. Each transaction we're targeting, can't take more than a millisecond of execution time on a single core. And the median right now is half a millisecond. So you can kind of think of it, if I have a single core that's available, that thing can do 2000 TPS. Modern day computers come in 128 cores. Our minimum requirements right now are 16 core systems, and that's enough to handle the current load. So for us, scaling is, how do we squeeze, obviously, all the performance we can out of the hardware? We're not using a VM. We're using Berkeley Packet Filter, which is a, battle-tested VM that's designed for low latency, kind of high packet rate processing. We build our own, execution environment. It's in theory scalable to SIMD, to GPUs, to things like that. So you can actually envision where you have markets like Serum, where all the transaction does is find me a place in the price time queue and then flip some bits. You have 100,000 of those. You can throw them all on a GPU and process them, and single instruction, multiple data kind of processing. All those things are possible in the way we've designed Solana, and those are our scaling options. And in theory, there's some ways we can also do delayed execution, like asynchronous execution. But at the end of the day, all the nodes have to be provisioned for the worst case, which means they have to be provisioned to handle all the state in terms of storage, and all the execution in terms of hardware processing. And that's actually easier to do versus do that plus have these real-time guarantees. Once you stuff those real-time guarantees there, you have to over-provision the system to such a point that the rest of the problems are kind of not as bad.
Anatoly, thank you. I guess this is the framing of this conversation is actually as a debate. So why don't we stay on Solana, but we'll now hear from the Starkware side. How do you think about the scaling solution from the hardware perspective? And how do you think about Solana's implementation?
If I may, I would like to just using what Anatoly just said to explain how we can provide additional scale on top of that. So, for example, let's take the example of exchange and trading, like what was described previously. And let's say that I want to cut on data, right? Because I don't want to prevent any essential data from any node, but I also want to run everything in a trustless manner. So, for example, if I think on order book and people signing orders, then I have to include the signature in every transaction in the network, which is an overhead on data. But the other option that I have is to use a Stark proof to prove that I've seen a valid signature for this order. And then I don't have to propagate the data of the signature of every order, which saves, let's say, about 50% of data just on orders signature. And a different example, if I think of settlements.
How much time does that take?
I just want to give another, if I may, another example on execution. If you have like a sequence of settlements, then sure, you want to verify all of them to be trusted. So then you're going to execute them. And because they're sequential, let's say it's the same market maker, whatever, 3 arrows are trading now 100 trades per second, then you have to verify each and every one of them. If you have a Stark proof for the execution of these 100 transactions, then you don't have to rerun every transaction. Instead, you can just verify a single proof and then take those transactions as granted that they are correct. So that's what we mean by scaling with data and with computation. That's what I want to say.
Kyle, obviously, when we have brilliant technical people here having these conversations, sometimes we can all get lost in the weeds, particularly people who aren't technical. I hear this argument basically as one between hardware being able to execute transactions more quickly on the Solana side and on the Starkware side. This is about something called zero knowledge proofs, the ability to understand that something is known without actually revealing it to the party who's verifying it. Is that a rough kind of quick and dirty framework for people who are following along at home?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the idea is that you can have like a roll-up, which there's many implementations of them. The Starkware team, I think, is the market leader. And the idea is that you can have a set of computation that is proved in a zero knowledge way and then implemented back to a main chain in a faster, cheaper, more secure way. So this is the basic principle behind Starkware. But as LA said at the beginning, it's not specific to any chain. Could be done on any chain. In fact, could be done for even non-blockchain use cases. So the idea here is that potentially it could be used to even help Solana scale.
Yeah. And one more question for Kyle before we let Anatoly jump back in. For people who may have lost track of the big picture here, what's the context for this? Why does this matter? And why is this such an important debate as blockchain scaling becomes an issue?
You need look no further than Ethereum fees right now. They are very high. And this, I think, is the whole catalyst. So there are lots of computer scientists working on ways to scale blockchains. Whether it is with hardware, software, different kinds of rollups, with sharding. I mean, there's many different potential solutions. But I think for this conversation, the most interesting are, the Solana hardware solution, I guess, and the Starkware zero knowledge solution.
Let's go back to Anatoly. I know he had something you wanted to add.
Yeah. So the problem is that the way a transaction lifetime works in Solana is wallet pops something up to a user, they sign it, that transaction flies directly to the block producer. That block producer doesn't really execute it. It encodes it into the block and propagates it out as fast as they can. So that pipeline of receiving the transaction, then sending it out, there's very limited amount of batching there. Even at, you count all the activity that's on chain, including votes and everything else, that's roughly 2,500 TPS. The amount of batching they actually get is maybe 20 to 30 transactions at a time. So it's barely even scalable across like AVX or SIMD. So let alone let's fire up a prover and get all the stick compressed and then send it out. So what we want to do is skip the execution there and just shove the data out as fast as we can. So that asynchronous execution bit at the leader already works. But when you receive it on the replay side, again, you're dealing with how do I stream this data in as it's streaming in real time, process it. And there is opportunity there if you're dealing with, if you make that entire system fully asynchronous and you only provide a proof once every couple minutes or something like that. But you still have to provision for this fire hose of all-to-all communication verification, because you have to confirm that when I'm receiving the state, for me to trade on the state, I won't have some guarantees that the state is what all the other traders are trading against. Them not being, fooled when I take risk with my capital. So handling all those votes, processing all those messages. Sure, if there's if Stark is faster than GPU or AVX, we don't really care. We'll throw whatever the fastest way to verify those. So far, we even looked at BLS segregation, which is a fairly common scheme. And even at that point, it's slower than throwing the stuff onto simple silicon that's available everywhere in Intel. So from that perspective, we're kind of looking at, all the trade-offs, but none of them are faster than simple AVX or GPU execution on a common Intel processor. And you have to do all this work, right? Because the guarantee we're providing is that once you connect to this network, you have all the state, you're guaranteed that you're observing the same markets as everyone else. And that means you can start trading.
So what I'm hearing from Anatoly, Kyle, is that despite the sophistication of the layer 2 protocols, it's faster to execute these transactions on silicon.
The trade-off is you got to throw the hardware there. You have to pay for it. And that means that overall the network may cost more to run. But what we're seeing in practice is that additional bandwidth that the network provides is so much larger that the cost to the users is much, much lower, right? The amortized cost per transaction to a user is greatly reduced.
Let me jump in and basically use Anatoly's answer to pinpoint the difference between what Starkware is doing and how Solana is doing. And I want to start off by basically complimenting Anatoly and his team at Solana for being the world leaders in terms of scale using hardware, right? There's no period, full stop. Where we differ is, our Stark provers also utilize very massive and dedicated hardware. The point where we differ is in the way we utilize, very new and innovative software on top of that hardware. In our system, and basically only in our system, in the system that uses cryptographic proofs, you can have a situation where one big machine with dedicated hardware that need not be trusted by anyone else can process a shitload of transactions and then generate a very, very small proof that everyone else can trust with perfect certainty. Whereas all the other blockchains, Ethereum, Bitcoin, Solana included, whatever hardware they use, be it small or big, is used to replicate the processing of all of these transactions and all the data that's associated with them. Now, just to give one example where you can see this being different is, suppose that for some reason you have a lot of interactions that are being done, let's say, between Alice and Bob, back and forth, very quick things, some high frequency trading that's happening just between these two things. So in all blockchains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana included, you will need in the end to relay all of this data, all of the signatures and the trades and so on. And maybe you can do this at great speed and maybe in parallel. Only with Starks, you can basically say at the end of the day, this is the settlement, the net settlement, and here's a very short proof. And you need not give anything else. You don't need to trust the machine that did that. You only need the proof. And this is really a game changer. It's really very different. And it allows you to have, if you have, let's say, N big computers, 10 or 1,000, you could each time utilize a different one of them to take care of this shitload of transactions. And then all the rest of the world, they need not be big computers. They could be cell phones. They could know that these transactions were processed with integrity, which is what our technology is about.
I also want to say, I always thought you guys were awesome. What you're doing is basically science fiction. And at first kind of broke my brain because somebody that, spends day and night thinking about Shannon Hartley theorem and compression and how to move bits around the world. It seems like magic. So congrats on all the progress. And I remember talking to you guys 4 years ago and how early those days, how little worked and how many things were still theoretical, and just to see all this stuff accomplished, really, really awesome to see. And I think what you get to is the key difference of, I think maybe how I've tried to frame this between the vision for Solana and Ethereum as a whole is that Solana is this execution layer. It is designed for visibility of the data globally. And to compress it and to remove all that information and then only send the final settlement balances is removing value from the network, right? Because me as a trader actually want to see when that trade happened, when Alice or created the order, when Bob created the order, and start building my models on top of that. So this is kind of like, like in finance, you start seeing specialization. Some things focus on execution, some things focus on settlement, and that's totally fine. I think that's probably how the world is going to, play out.
It's so interesting to listen to this conversation. I should probably add that both projects have raised a great deal of money recently. Starkware just raised $50 million in a Series C round led by Sequoia, which I believe is a total of $111 million raised, and a total market post-money cap value of $2 billion. And this summer, Solana raised $314 million in a round led by A16Z and Polychain Capital. So these are questions that investors are very interested in seeing answered. I'd like to throw back to Kyle here, who is in the same position as I am to a certain extent, and our audience. We're listening to this sort of very highly technical debate right at the bleeding edge of transaction processing, of blockchain distributed ledger tech. At the end of the day, Kyle, you're an investor. You listen to these conversations, and then you have to place bets. You have to invest your capital. How do you think about this as you listen to what we're hearing here today? How do you process it, and then how do you respond?
Well, we've invested in both. So we, from our perspective, we were just investing in different approaches, but the best teams that were accomplishing those. And actually, one follow-up question that I would have is, we talked about scalability, let's say at a base layer. What about what you can build on top? So I think Anatoly mentioned, the idea of being a transaction layer, so a NASDAQ. But what about, let's talk about property. So composability. This is a property that a lot of applications benefit from. Maybe we can start with Anatoly. But then when we go to Starkware, there's actually a couple of different products, one which is just live today, StarkNet Alpha, which maybe he can also explain in the same way.
Before we go to Anatoly, Kyle, let's define composability for people who don't understand what that means and why it's significant in the blockchain space.
The idea is that multiple applications will be using the same base layer for execution, computation, security, but then they will want to talk to each other. And so you may want to use a borrow platform and borrow assets and then move them to another application where you can have the trading happen, and then use an Oracle, from a third application. And you want all of that to kind of work together. And this is one of the things that Ethereum does very well, but is again having scaling questions right now. So Solana has a certain approach to that.
Our composability is that it's a single giant state machine, and it's one design like almost like a traditional database. We have committed read isolation level for transactions. That means that when a transaction reads a value from any place in the state, it gets the same value every time it reads it, and that state is globally visible. The challenge is that we've designed this thing to be scalable in terms of state size. In theory, petabyte is what I'm imagining. Then that's an interesting number, because you can't stuff that many reads in a single transaction anymore. You can never really read the entire state, the global state, in a single transaction. So devs have to specify what bits of the state they're going to read, and we can guarantee that those reads are consistent and isolated, but we can't allow a single transaction to walk the entire state. This is actually where we are getting let down the zero knowledge kind of path, where to provide a trustless oracle of walking the entire state and running some long compute application, like some long query, like walk all the token balances and sum them up and tell me that they're equal to X, or something like that. That computation is basically impossible to do from inside the state machine itself. You have to walk this thing outside of the state machine, and then how do you feed this information back? Providing, light client proofs of all the different parts that you've computed is going to be extremely expensive in terms of bandwidth. So using something like a Starkware or a zero knowledge engine that can aggregate all this and then provide a succinct proof that this result actually matches from what I read from the state machine, that would be awesome. And that is like we're doing active research there. So composability for Solana is somewhat closer to Ethereum's layer 1, like that true, like you have the entire state, you can do whatever you want with it. But there's limits that I think aren't yet hit because we even haven't seen that amount of usage in Ethereum to where you start thinking about, well, how do I write smart contracts that are aware of the entire globe, like the entire scope of the entire chain? And that's going to happen, right? So we want to get ahead of that.
I understand EVM is coming to Solana too soon. We invested in a project that's working on that.
This is, by the way, for those who don't know, this is the Ethereum virtual machine that allows interoperability.
So I'm a true OS kind of geek. Solana's runtime is like a very, very gnarly embedded system, but you can think of it as an operating system. And Neon is a port of Sputnik VM that runs as a Solana program, using our tool chain and our sysroot, and executes the bytecode interpreter for EVM, byte for byte compatible. So you can actually start handling Ethereum transactions, in Solana. That was blood, sweat, and tears by that team. So pretty amazing accomplishment. That still maintains some. It allows for some parallelization too. So leverages the Solana account model. You can run transactions in parallel that don't overlap the same state. So pretty amazing feat.
On our side, Avihu is the expert on composability on our side, how we address it.
But Eli, maybe just say a few words about Starknet.
So, Kyle, as you said, today, the day we're recording it, this probably airs a bit later, but we just a few hours ago, Avihu, basically the whole team were celebrating the launch of the alpha Starknet on mainnet, which means it's the first time that a validity rollup is this thing that's also somewhat erroneously called the ZK rollup, but it's this proof-based system for scaling with general computation is live on mainnet for every dApp developer to write dApps for and transactions to be submitted. This just happened, as we're recording, like 2 hours ago. So that's something we're very proud of because it sort of opens our stack to any dApp developer. And yeah, Avihu, you're the expert on composability in our system. So how do we allow things to compose?
Yes, so I think one of the main goals that we are actually trying to achieve in Starknet is to enable everything, all the good that we are already enabling in StarkX, our current scalability engine that runs some of the top applications on Ethereum today. But we wanted to take it also to a place where there is one single global state for all applications, and then every transaction can be potentially very complex and include calls to many applications and still be executed at once. So that's part of what Starknet achieves, basically full composability on the state of all applications. I also wanted to so what Anatoly said about the use of ZK technology in Solana, it actually kind of reminded me something very interesting that we are targeting of doing as one of the first applications on Starknet. And this is, we basically, what Anatoly described is it's almost one-to-one to this application. It's basically the need to prove information that is like very, a lot of information on the Ethereum state that Ethereum can't in a single or reasonable cost prove. So one use case of this pretty abstract statement is to say, let's count votes, right? We have many DAOs, and every DAO has many token holders, and we want to have like thousands of token holders participating by voting on yes and no on important decisions. But the problem is that it's not very feasible to say, okay, let's pay $10 per voter per vote, and then have thousands of voters in every decision. So by being able to prove stuff about the state of Ethereum, we can say, hey, look, this is the list of voters, and this is what was their token balance, and we can summarize it and say this was the total amount of yes, this was the total amount of no, and send it to Ethereum. And we can use Starknet contracts for that. And we don't need to change those smart contracts on Ethereum, and we could potentially prove any statements on any state, not just of Ethereum, but of any other chain. And to start with, we are obviously starting with Ethereum, but any state that we can relate to in any way, we could prove similar statements about.
I want to make a comment, which is so I know that it's often nice to portray, for viewing and for more action as some big clash, as if Solana and Starknet are fighting each other. But what you're really hearing, and this is the way technology works, is that there's this huge problem that we need blockchains to go out there and conquer the world. Okay, and then what's going to happen, as is the case, let's say, with cellular communication, is that you throw at it whatever gives you more scale. And usually these things go together. So you have the fiber optics and, new standards and whatnot. And what Anatoly and his team are leading is the sort of hardware approach to parallelization, more pipelining, separation of state, which is, it's a must in more scalable blockchains. What we're bringing to this table is this novel, very blockchain-friendly technology of allowing even an untrusted big machine to prove its integrity to everyone else and who can check it easily. So it's not surprising that Anatoly is saying that they're looking into ZK proofs, and we on our side definitely will need to have space separation and things like that at some point in the future. That's the way technology works.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's part of the reason we invested in both teams. I think that the solutions are obviously the demand is quite high, and I think one of the one of the final questions. I don't know how much time we have left here, but one of the final questions I would have is, in your view, what is a solution or an application that you think would potentially work better on the other network? So you mentioned the strong suits, but what is like an example that you think could actually, like for Anatoly, that you think Starkware would particularly benefit from, or would benefit from Starkware, and then vice versa for LA?
I think applications where you want some privacy in terms of what's happening. Like you may have some semi-trusted sequencer. You don't trust them to do execution. What you trust them for is that they're not going to leak information when they do it. And then the resulting settlement balances end up on chain. So you're not trusting them with actually doing the work. What you're trying to make sure is that you kind of have some markets that aren't globally exposed. There's obvious reasons for that. So that to me is like almost like a perfect design where you have the final results of the computation and you have a Stark proof that says, hey, we did the right work. And then you can observe that information was never leaked. And that is a continuous kind of monitoring relationship. And you're trading effectively some censorship for privacy. And that trade-off, I think, is there's going to be, thousands of use cases that make that trade-off. And it seems pretty obvious to me.
I don't know if the mic picked that up, Kyle, but you just said dark pool. Interestingly enough, you and I think, both started our careers at Credit Suisse, where dark pools were, I think, pioneered.
Yes, it's a huge problem, particularly for on-chain DEX trading. People can see what you're doing. In fact, miners can frequently front run what you're doing because they see the transaction first. So I 100% agree that this is a massive use case.
Coolest thing for me would be that so there is like I don't know if your listeners are aware, like flashbots and all these other things are technologies that are trying to democratize miner extractable value. What would be awesome is if you have this system running on top of each validator on Solana, where you can start doing trustless order flow, where you can trust that the system is being fair as in terms of how it's receiving orders and how it's creating the final block. But you're not trusting it with you can have a Stark proof that verifies that it's actually doing the right thing. And that would be, to me, a really cool, combination of both, right? You now have these guarantees that are providing that, orders are fairly, submitted into blocks, but they're still done at this like link line rate. So that would be pretty cool. Someday, maybe. Once we put out all the other fires.
I want to answer from our side, but also say we have an imbalance here. So we're like two from Starkware against one from Solana. But in this case, it's going to work in your benefit because I'm going to give one example, and I'm sure Avihu has many examples. So that's why I'll go first because I don't have as many examples. So we'll both say something that benefits Solana. You get two of those compliments. I would go with I would say that most transactions in the world, there's probably an exponentially decreasing scale of complexity and how much states are connected. So like the vast majority, if you imagine all the payments of the world coming onto a blockchain, let it be Solana, then many of those are going to be naturally state separated, and then this massive parallelization is really, really good for it. So like the majority of use cases probably would fare very well on Solana, and in fact they probably do fare on Solana, which is why Solana is killing it these days. So that's one thing where I think Solana is like really, really good at. And I'll let Avihu, I'm sure he has 5 other examples, so I'll let him give another one.
Yeah, I can just continue your line of thought that's more or less what I was thinking, that any application that can greatly benefit from parallel execution makes tons of sense on Solana. So one example that pops up is for example, the part of order books where you have many people just want to put orders. So maybe not the execution there, but the visibility of the order book. So for example, just presenting the order book where there is you can do these things in parallel because no order is touching any other order is something that you can see very nicely running on Solana today.
Definitely. Well, there's many more applications as well, but I thought that would be a nice way to close off here.
I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to say something as a final thought, final takeaways for our audience. Obviously, this has been a pretty fascinating conversation here. It started out as a debate. It's become a very constructive conversation. I think at the bleeding edge of what's possible with the technology, where we are today. I know a lot of people who are watching this conversation have tried to execute transactions on Ethereum, been bogged down with speed, and looked at the gas fees and been like, oh my God, why am I paying $140 to get executed on this? This conversation really peels the onion away, gives what's going on beneath the surface, the conversations that are happening in the community, and we got to be a fly on the wall to listen to those today. Let's go back to you, Avihu. Final thoughts about this conversation, all the things that we've discussed here today.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, we are really trying to tackle like the most fundamental issues with execution and data on blockchain, and we are trying to bring validity proofs to help with these issues as quick as possible and as good as possible. So that's basically what we are doing.
Eli, final thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank you, Ash, and Kyle for basically inviting us to be alongside with Anatoly and Solana. With the network valuation of 60 billion and counting. We don't have any token, and to those asking, when token, there's the 2-word answer, which is no comment. So it's a great honor for us to be sitting on this stage with Anatoly and Solana. A lot of respect for their technology and what they're doing. Our own hope and vision is that this technology will of starks or zero knowledge starks, right? ZK starks will help humanity basically have better ownership of data in the biggest sense possible, and allow citizens to put in check even the strongest of monopolies and governments. And this is a technology capable of that. And I think blockchains are just the way that we're bringing it to bear on the world, but sort of that's our vision. And I'm sure it's also in line with, it doesn't contradict or compete with Anatoly's or any other blockchain. It's some complementary technology that we are sure will be used by everyone in the world, hopefully soon.
Anatoly, over to you. Final thoughts.
The media loves the us versus them narrative. It's kind of fun. So I'm happy to play along. I think what people need to realize is that the core of what we're building, isn't the technology itself. It's this idea that humans, like individuals, can have cryptography that they know how to use and they're powered with it. And that is a really, really powerful thing. There's maybe 5 million people that sign stuff today on any networks, all networks combined, like actually know, like, hey, I have custody, I'm signing this, I want this effect to happen in this, shared state machine. That's going to go to 100 million, it's going to go to 1 billion people, and it's going to transform the world. And this is kind of the more exciting part, is like, think about how do we get that billion users to actually start using cryptography with self-custody and signing things. That's the challenge.
Yeah, such an important point. Kyle, we come back to you. I think just an incredible conversation listening to this here today. It's the kind of conversation that you and VCs, investors get to hear in coffee shops in Palo Alto. The rest of us who maybe aren't fortunate enough to be in the room for those conversations got to be in the room virtually here with this conversation. Final thoughts from what we've heard here today.
The future that we're all working towards is using applications, actually. So the teams here today are the people that are going to be on Mount Rushmore someday, but not that people are going to be looking and thinking about that they use every, powered by this, powered by that. It's rather the application. So these are the enablers, and we're at the bleeding edge of that right now. So that's why it's so exciting. But once all this starts working together, applications are going to be, are really where the UX of the user picks up, and that's what's really exciting.
Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us here today. Obviously, so much more to cover. There's only one solution. We're going to have all of you back on the show to have these conversations in even more detail. Thank you so much for joining us.